James Dutt, the Alumni Council VP. Is he around? Where is he? Stand up. All right, right here. Oh, there he is. All right. Deb Holt, one of our trustees, one of our favorite trustees over here. Zach Jew, who is the major gifts officer for the college back there. Dick Jewell, President Emeritus. I call him President Eternal at Grove City College. We would not be here right now if not for Dick, who founded this group. Melissa McLeod, Senior Director, Alumni and College Relations, right here behind Dick. Bill Mahaffey, another favorite trustee. They're all favorite trustees, right? But no, Bill really is too. Brent Moon of the Alumni Council over here. Former Congressman Tim Murphy is here. And make sure you say hi. So it is an honor to have him here. And he just published a book through Humanix Publishing, which came out, I think, just a few months ago. And it's The Christ Cure, right? That's the title. It's really very, very good. So an honor to have him here. Carol Yanuzzi, the Alumni Council President, over. Good to have them and all of you back here. So Larry Reed, our speaker today, we started this series back in 2005. Back then it was the American Founders Lecture Series. And then a few years ago, we changed it to the Foundations of American Leadership Series. And when we did, it was precisely thinking of people like Andrew Mellon. I mean, we talked about the American founders. We could do John Adams, George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. But we couldn't go far enough out ahead, right, to hit people like Andrew Mellon. And like we had a few months ago, Jackie Robinson, who Professor Gary Scott Smith talked about. So I wanted to do Andrew Mellon from the very beginning, and I've been wanting to bring Larry Reed here to speak too. So his book, Real Heroes, which is outside and covers figures as diverse as Cicero, Augustine, Bastiat. In fact, where's Steve Dewey? Steve Dewey is here. He heads the Bastiat Society in Washington, D.C. He's a Grove City grad. All the way up through Roberto Clemente and Andrew Mellon. So that's it. We got to get Larry here. But backing up a little bit, Larry was born in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, so he's a local guy. And went to the same high school as Joe Namath. And Joe Namath turned 80 this past week. Isn't it hard to imagine, isn't it? Larry's not 80. He's younger than that. Went to the same high school as Joe Namath. He graduated from Grove City College in the class of 75, which I understand is the best year in the history of Grove City College, I was told just a few minutes ago. He eventually became, among other things, president of the Foundation for Economic Education. Now, if you don't know that, it's called FEE, F-E-E, fee.org, and it's a fantastic group. And Grove City College has a great history with it. In fact, we've had previous Grove City people who were president of FEE. Bill Sparks, who was the father of John Sparks, was president of FEE at one point. And who else? Famous Grove City College professor, economics, Hans Senholz. Hans Senholz. And they published The Freeman, which was a lot of you probably read, and as Larry was saying, at one point had a circulation of 50,000 print edition. But go to fee.org and you could see all of their great work. So he retired from that in 2019 after 11 years as president, and now he's president emeritus of FEE. Prior to that, Larry served for 21 years as the first president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Michigan. That's in Midland, Michigan. It is, I'm not just saying this to be nice, it's the best state-level think tank. Well, Commonwealth too. Commonwealth Foundation. I say Commonwealth and Mackinac are really the two best. It's spelled Mackinac, right, but pronounced Mackinac. Jarrett Skorup, one of our first student fellows, has been at Mackinac for I think about 10 years now. And he also there in Midland taught economics at Northwood University, which is a good school with a good free market economics department. He's the author of more than 2,000 articles, 7 books, the most recent being Was Jesus a Socialist? Come on, Larry, we know the answer to that. Of course he was a socialist, right? Was Jesus a Socialist? The one that he has outside, Real Heroes, Inspiring True Stories of Courage, Character, and Conviction, of which Andrew Mellon is one of them. He's delivered speeches in all 50 states and most of the 87 countries that he's visited. This is really neat. In 2022, the president of Poland, that would be Duda, he's a good one, he's a good president, announced that he will award Reed the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. You're not even Polish, are you? All right. The highest honor that the country bestows upon a foreigner. Does that mean, we haven't talked about this, maybe your work on Jerzy Papayushko, perhaps. He's one of the heroes in your book, so the famous priest of the Solidarity movement who was killed by the communists in the 1980s. In fact, one closing thought on that was kind of a homecoming for Larry. He emailed yesterday, he's staying at the William Penn Hotel, which is across the street from Mellon Square. And he told Brenda and I that the last time that he was at Mellon Square was in 1968 with the Young Americans for Freedom when he was burning a Soviet flag after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And I said, we could applaud for that, right? But I said, could we do it again tomorrow, just for old time's sake, right? I'll bring the box of matches. But Larry didn't have a Soviet flag with him, so we couldn't pull it off. And I'll also add here, too, a personal thought that Andrew Mellon was the great uncle of Dick Scaife. And the Scaife folks have been good friends of the Institute for Faith and Freedom. And I remember talking to Dick often about Andrew Mellon. And Dick Scaife loathed FDR. In fact, Dick, you said that your grandmother, you never heard FDR referred to anything other than, was it that son of a bitch Roosevelt?
GDR.
Yeah. GDR, that's what he thought the initials were. But what FDR did to Andrew Mellon is scandalous in the 1930s, harassing him and pursuing him with the IRA, just terrible. And so that was, that really bothered Dick. He was immensely proud of his uncle. So what Andrew Mellon did, you're going to hear about this today, with the tax cuts in the 1920s, this native Pittsburgher was enormously important, and it still has great importance today. So I've said too much. Here's Larry Reed to talk about Andrew Mellon.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Western Pennsylvania. There's another Pittsburgh connection that I should mention here, Pittsburgh and Grove City College. When I was a high school junior or senior, I chose the University of Pittsburgh campus because I like the mountains. Just a month or two before I was to graduate and a few months before I was to start at Titusville, I went to a convention of Young Americans for Freedom in New Jersey. And one of the speakers was Dr. Hans Senholz from Grove City College. And I was mesmerized. And anybody who had him as a professor, how many did? You know how he could easily mesmerize you. And I went up afterwards to him. We talked about this years afterwards. And I was so excited. I said, Dr. Senholz, I'm going to transfer as soon as I can out of Pitt and come to Grove City if they'll have me. Are you still going to be here? Because I was deathly afraid he'd leave. I would just show up and he'd be gone. But he stayed, another 25 years. A wonderful professor. And I did transfer. I had, that fall, I had a Marxist as a poli-sci prof and a dyed-in-the-wool Keynesian economist as my econ prof, and I'd already read enough to have some problems with those ways of thinking, and I just got kind of tired of beating my head against the wall, so I went to Grove City where I majored in economics. So anyway, thanks for having me. It's great to see Dick Jewell. I see you carry the same title I do, President Emeritus. I don't know if you had the same experience, Dick, but after I graduated to the Emeritus title, I had people who were introducing me as a speaker, and they would say, I guess I had not seen the word before, they would say, and he is now President Emeritus. And so I would always say, no, I take medication for that. But it's great to have an emeritus position where you still work full-time, but you get to do what you most enjoy, which for me is writing and speaking. Well, today we're going to talk about Andrew Mellon and other good guys and some bad guys, maybe two or three of each, relating to the Great Depression. The Great Depression, of course, was by any estimation a national trauma. Unemployment peaked out in the high 20s, 28, 29%, in that vicinity. We've never seen anything since then as bad. It was not the first depression in American history, but it was by far the longest and the deepest. We'd had half a dozen recessions or depressions earlier in our history, in every case brought on primarily by monetary policies that were erratic and harmful. And 1929 was no different. But they were all over with in a year or two or three. In fact, the worst of them before the Great Depression was over with in less than 4 years, in the 1890s. The Great Depression that begins in 1929 lasts a minimum of 12 years. I'm sure you've heard people say, oh, well, we can say it was over in 1941. I'm one of those who argues that not really. If you look at unemployment numbers, yeah, in the early 40s, they'll fall dramatically because, in part, we drafted 11 million men and sent them overseas, and it didn't count in the unemployment figures anymore. But in terms of general standards of living, economic recovery that was enjoyed by the broad masses of people, we didn't see that until after the war, 1945, 46. So in that case, you could say this was a 16-year episode in American history, at least three, perhaps four times longer than any previous depression. That cries out for an explanation. Why did it start, and why did it last so long, as well as why was it so deep? Well, I hope to answer that question in the context of sharing with you some stories of good guys and bad guys in the Great Depression. And the first one is definitely a good guy, and that's Andrew Mellon. There have been about almost 80 people who have served as U.S. Treasury Secretary since Alexander Hamilton. And if I had to rank the best, I think I would put Andrew Mellon certainly in the top 3 or 4, if not the best of them all. From 1921 to 1932, longer than any other Treasury Secretary but 2, he served in that position under 3 presidents, named originally by Warren Harding. Calvin Coolidge kept him on, as did Herbert Hoover for a time, a total of 10 years and 11 months, which is quite a remarkable run as head of the Treasury Department. And as Pittsburghers or people from this area, you know that his business prowess before he became Treasury Secretary was quite remarkable. He was able to pick cutting-edge technologies better than just about anybody. He was able to pick the right entrepreneurs to bet on. He built a financial and industrial empire in steel and oil and shipbuilding, coal, coke, banking, and of course, aluminum. When he was tapped by Warren Harding in 1921, newly elected President Warren Harding to be Treasury Secretary, he was the 3rd highest income taxpayer in the United States. He really didn't need the money that the Treasury Secretary position paid him, but just so you know, it was $12,000. That was the annual salary for the Treasury Secretary at that time. One of the people in Congress who did not like Mr. Mellon, who was kind of a demagogue of the left, Senator James Couzens of Michigan, often attacked Mellon for his tax-cutting predilections. And Couzens once mentioned, in a very negative way, he said, Andrew Mellon, if he gets this latest tax cut package that he's pushing through, he will reap a benefit greater than the benefits to be achieved by all the taxpayers, all the federal taxpayers of the state of Nebraska. What Couzens failed to mention was that Andrew Mellon paid more taxes than every single federal income taxpayer in the state of Nebraska. When he came to Washington, the federal income tax, of course, was only not quite a decade old. It was passed in 1913 under Woodrow Wilson. And during the debate over the income tax, there were people who scoffed at the notion that the top rate would ever exceed 10%. That was like, oh my gosh, no, we'd never do that. That's outlandish. But before Woodrow Wilson's presidency was over, I mean, this is the man who signed the income tax into law. Before his presidency was over, the top rate would be 73%, more than 7 times the highest that any prominent person thought it could ever go. Mellon was among those who noticed the negative effect of those high rates. He knew that they were putting scarce capital to flight, that people were going with their money someplace else, overseas, or investing in sterile assets or government securities. In fact, one person that he often cited was the son of John D. Rockefeller, a brother of John D. Rockefeller, William. He pointed out, Mellon did, that William Rockefeller had several times more money in government securities than he had in Standard Oil stock, largely because of the tax advantages to do that. And Mellon realized that that's not good for capital formation in our private enterprise system, that subsidizing government deficits doesn't produce nearly the technology, the productivity, the jobs, and the innovation that you get from the productive, profit-seeking private sector. He also pointed out, by the way, that Henry Ford made more money when he cut the price of his cars from $3,000 to less than $400. He made more money when he cut the price of cars to a fraction of what they originally were than if he had kept the price high at $3,000 a car. And Mellon was one of those who put 2 and 2 together and said, there's a lesson here that we can draw in government. We should be reducing the burden, especially on high incomes, of high income tax rates. So when he became Treasury Secretary for 10 years and 11 months, he put together what became known as the Mellon Plan, which was a series of substantial tax rate reductions. And some people might say, oh, well, he probably did that just to help the rich. But if you look at the reductions in the lowest income categories, the percentage reduction that low-income people enjoyed was far greater than the percentage income tax rate reductions that wealthy people enjoyed. By the time he was done, he brought the top tax rate from 73% all the way down to 24%. And that was over the course of the Harding and Coolidge presidencies. You might then think, well, they must have run a tremendous deficit in the federal budget if they were cutting rates like that. Nope. Every single budget of the Harding and Coolidge years was in surplus. Mellon and largely Coolidge, working together, reduced the national debt by more than 1/3. And would you believe the presidency of Calvin Coolidge is the last one in which government was smaller when the president left office than it was when he took office, in terms of its spending in real terms. That's quite a remarkable achievement, and nobody's come close to that, of course, ever since. Mellon exerted considerable influence during his time, not only on reducing tax rates, but also in reducing expenditures. By the way, he tried to do away with the estate tax, which was 40%. He wasn't able to get that through Congress. He and Coolidge pressed for its abolition, but they were able at least to cut it in half to 20%. We all remember from our history books and from perhaps our grandparents how awful the Great Depression was, but you may not have been told that there was a very substantial depression early in Andrew Mellon's tenure as Treasury Secretary that preceded the Great Depression of 1929. And that happened in 1921-22. It was a sharp downturn. Unemployment was well into double digits. Why do we forget that one? Well, it was so brief. Why was it so brief? Because Harding and his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, felt that the way to get through this was to basically leave the market alone, get off its back, get out of its way. They had just seen sky-high tax rates enacted under Woodrow Wilson, massive spending hikes for the World War I and other things. They were determined not to intervene, to allow the economy to adjust and to help it adjust by getting off its back. And that depression was over with in a matter of months. That's the last time America had a substantial economic downturn. And the government basically did the right thing. Stopped the policies that caused it in the first place and did not enact the kinds of policies that would prolong it as we did in the 1930s. You might think back to your history of the 1920s and remember that that was the era of Prohibition as well. Andrew Mellon, as head of the Treasury Department, presided over the Principal Enforcement Bureau for Prohibition. So you may be wondering, well, was he in favor of it? No, he was not. He detested it. I mean, he couldn't outright flout it. It was the law, but he instructed his department to do the least that they could and still comply with the law. You know that one of the ways that people got around Prohibition at that time was to secure a medical prescription from their doctor for certain amounts of whiskey. And, and in fact, in New York State alone, in the 1920s, the number of registered pharmacists went up by like a factor of 4. 4 times as many registered pharmacists because of this. And it's true that Mellon possibly had a conflict of interest. He had a large interest in Old Overholt Distillery. And he did dispense a license to the distillery so that it could issue or honor prescriptions for whiskey that were presented to it by doctors. But I can't blame him because I think Prohibition was really a bad idea. And one of the reasons he didn't like it was he thought it was completely unenforceable. He thought people wouldn't pay it any attention, and we now know that's pretty much what happened. And he thought that it was corrupting of government officials. And he was sure right about that. I have some figures for you. Of the 17,816 agents who served in that enforcement bureau from 1920 to 1930, almost 18,000, 11,926, that is what, 2/3? 2/3 were forced out on suspicion of corruption. Honest men like, Eliot Ness and his Untouchables, they were the exception, not the rule. He ran afoul of Congress over the Prohibition issue when Congress ordered him to produce statistics on how much liquor was being imported into the U.S. by foreign embassies. They wanted, because foreign embassies belong to the country of the embassy. It's not our property, it's their property on our soil. Congress said they're bringing in booze in violation of the U.S. law. We want to know how much. And Mellon simply refused. He said it's unconstitutional. I can't do that. It's not our property. And if they want to bring booze in, there's nothing we can do about it. I give him some credit. He was on the right side of Prohibition and was not the kind of guy who would sick agents on Americans because they wanted to drink. I'm sure he took note of some colorful cases, too, at the time. As the 20s wore on, there were more and more instances of juries throwing out cases against people who were accused of being involved somehow or another illegally in the liquor trade. And there's a great story. If you have access to the old New York Times archives online, there was an article in January 1929 about a man named George Bevan. He was accused of an alcohol violation. And the principal evidence that the prosecutors produced was a pint of liquor. And when the jury went to deliberate, they left the jury with the evidence for several hours, and the jurors sampled the evidence until it was gone, claiming they did so to determine if, in fact, it was indeed alcoholic. And they found Bevan not guilty. Paul alluded to the fact that Franklin Roosevelt went after Andrew Mellon, and he did, with a vengeance. He sicked the tax authorities on him in the 1930s after he had left his job as Treasury Secretary and also a short stint as ambassador to Great Britain. But the bottom line of all that is that they found nothing. He was exonerated on everything, of all charges. In fact, a former IRS commissioner at that time, David Blair, blasted the whole affair. He said it was unwarranted abuse by, boy, does this sound familiar, unwarranted abuse by high officials of the government. And it was clearly one of those sorry episodes that exposed the nasty side of Franklin Roosevelt you don't always hear in the classroom. You do at Grove City, but maybe not other classrooms. So Andrew Mellon, I conclude, was a good guy. And I did not intend to spend my entire time talking about just him, but he is certainly important context for the events surrounding the 1920s and preceding the Great Depression. Another good guy was one of his bosses, Calvin Coolidge. I actually like Warren Harding more than most historians do too. But Calvin Coolidge kept Mellon on as his Treasury Secretary during the entire 5+ years he served as our president. And I rank him among our top 3 or 4 best presidents in our history. Let me just share with you something he said in his inaugural address in March of 1925. He said, "I am opposed to extremely high tax rates because they produce little or no revenue, because they are bad for the country, and finally because they're wrong. We cannot finance the country, we cannot improve social conditions through any system of injustice, even if we attempt to inflict it upon the rich. Those who suffer the most harm will be the poor. This country believes in prosperity. It is absurd to suppose that it is envious of those who are already prosperous. The wise and correct course to follow in taxation and all other economic legislation is not to destroy those who have already secured success, but to create conditions under which everyone will have a better chance to be successful." Wouldn't you like to have somebody in the White House who could say that today? One further paragraph, he said, "I favor the policy of economy, not because I wish to save money, but because I wish to save people. The men and women of this country who toil are the ones who bear the cost of the government. Every dollar that we carelessly waste means that their life will be so much more meager. Every dollar that we prudently save means that their life will be so much more abundant. Economy is idealism in its most practical form." Great president, underappreciated, but I want to remind you that on August 3, coming up, we will mark the centennial of the first full day of Calvin Coolidge's tenure as President of the United States. He took the oath when word came to him in his hometown of Plymouth, Vermont, early in the morning that Warren Harding had passed away. And by the light of either a candle or a kerosene lamp, I think it was, his father administered to him the oath of office because he was a justice of the peace, and that was the nearest you could get to a government official in Plymouth at 2 in the morning. And as soon as he took the oath, he went back to bed and served more than 5.5 years as our president. Well, if the tax policy, the fiscal policies of people like Harding and Mellon and Coolidge were so good, you might ask, well, how could you pretty quickly thereafter have a Great Depression? Didn't their policies in some way contribute to that? Which leads me to the principal explanation for the start of the Great Depression was not their fiscal policies. And then we'll talk briefly about how some bad guys kept the Depression going and made it even deeper than it ever needed to be as a corrective. The principal culprit in the start of the Great Depression was the Federal Reserve. And does it sound familiar to you if I say that The Fed drove interest rates to rock bottom lows and fueled a bubble in the economy for several years in the 1920s. Does that ring a bell? I can tell you I was actually present at Milton Friedman's 90th birthday party at the White House under President George Bush. And one of the speakers was Ben Bernanke, then the chairman of the Fed. And he actually said to about 100 of us, with Milton present, he said, "You were right, we caused it, but we learned we won't do that again." What he was alluding to is the fact that the Federal Reserve engineered from 1924 to early 29 a very substantial hike in the money and credit supply. And they drove interest rates to historic lows. We had a land boom in Florida. All the classic signs of a frothy boom. Mellon and Coolidge alluded to it and expressed some misgivings, but their attitude, especially Coolidge's, was that's Fed policy. We're supposed to be independent, or they're supposed to be independent of us. So they're doing their thing. We have misgivings about it. But they probably should have had even more pronounced misgivings, because the Fed was fueling a bubble that sooner or later would have to burst. You might ask, well, why were they doing that? Why were they, the Coolidge administration was doing great things with Mellon at the helm of treasury policy. They were cutting tax rates. That helps explain the Roaring '20s. But beneath it all, those good things were sort of covering up the bad things that were happening, this rampant expansion of money and credit that was not sustainable. A big reason that the Fed was doing it was to help Great Britain. Winston Churchill was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and of course he came to that office with Great Britain having gotten off of the gold standard during World War I, and he became convinced that Britain should return to the gold standard. So as Chancellor, he made steps to do that, but his error was he wanted to do it at a rate between gold and paper and gold and the pound and vis-a-vis the dollar. He wanted to do it at a rate that effectively said, oh, we didn't print any money. We want to go back to the pre-war rate, as if the Bank of England hadn't overdone it with its printing of paper pounds. Well, that was unrealistic. There were lots more paper pounds out there. And Britain would have lost gold substantially to the United States if there wasn't something done to stem that flow by returning to gold at an unrealistic ratio. He should have said, look, we have to devalue because we printed too many. But he didn't want to do that. He was too proud, I guess. But that unsustainable rate that he wanted to restore the gold standard at had implications back here in the United States. As a faithful ally, the United States wanted to assist his endeavor. And specifically at the Federal Reserve, they took measures to weaken the dollar so as to help strengthen the pound. And so one of the reasons for the expansion of money and credit here, driving interest rates down, was to assist an ally in its attempted return to gold. But that was unrealistic and probably not sustainable. And of course, it didn't last. We sometimes say, well, didn't the Depression start with the collapse of the stock market in October of 1929? I remember learning in high school that that was the principal cause of the Depression. The stock market fell and dragged everything else down with it. But what that fails to point out is that monetary policy had already dramatically shifted from expansion to now tightening and what would ultimately become contraction. You know that the Federal Reserve engineered a 66% expansion of the money and credit supply from 1924 to 29, and then presided over a 1/3 contraction of the money supply from 29 to 33. Some people actually thought, well, a deliberate disinflation would be the cure for the earlier frothy times. But that's like saying, once you've hit a man with a truck, the way to help him out is to put it in reverse and back up over it. And that's essentially what they did. And that's what Bernanke was alluding to, that the Fed had inflated, and then it, instead of stabilizing, it actually deliberately deflated, which made things even worse. Well, then we have 1932. a very pivotal year in American political history. A presidential election with the incumbent Herbert Hoover running for re-election against the charismatic orator from New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I don't know about you, but I learned in high school before I went to Grove City that Franklin Roosevelt saved us from the Depression, and Herbert Hoover was a stand pat, do nothing, hands off, laissez-faire president. Do you know, though, that during the 1932 campaign, it was quite clear that Roosevelt and the Democrats didn't believe that about Hoover. In fact, the Democratic Party platform for 1932 called for, and Roosevelt actually reinforced it in a speech right here in Pittsburgh in September, it called for a 25% reduction in government spending. Roosevelt assailed Hoover for, quote, presiding over the greatest taxing and spending administration in peacetime history. His running mate, John Nance Garner from Texas, accused Hoover of taking the country down the path to socialism. And they had a point, because it was Hoover who had, in 1930, signed into law the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which jacked tariffs up to an all-time high, virtually closed the border. His thinking was, well, we've got some nagging unemployment here, the stock market has crashed, and let's raise tariffs to keep out foreign goods. And that'll make Americans buy more American-made goods, and that'll put those unemployed people back to work. Do you know, before Hoover signed Smoot-Hawley in June of 1930, we didn't have a depression yet. The stock market, which had collapsed in October, had regained half of the ground it had lost by the spring of 1930. Unemployment was less than 9%. That's not even a depression yet, that's a recession. And it was in that climate that Hoover signed Smoot-Hawley, which essentially closed the borders to trade. And foreign countries, of course, are not going to take that. They retaliated, and it started a worldwide trade war. Any industry that depended upon the import-export trade, any aspect of it, probably got hit very hard, some much harder than others, because of the collapse of world trade, thanks to Smoot-Hawley. That was a Herbert Hoover project. 1932, by the way, Hoover and the Congress did something else that played into the election of that year. The feeling was in Washington that, well, we've got this big deficit in the federal budget. Well, of course you do, because people aren't working. Unemployment's 25%. Companies are going broke, so revenues are way down. Hoover was not of the view to cut spending to meet the shortfall. He was spending like crazy. He had his own bailout schemes like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So they decided, let's do something about that deficit by passing the Revenue Act of 1932. It doubled the income tax. Just what a depressed economy needs, right? And so the top rate in 1932 went from 24 to 63%. That's even more than a doubling at the highest incomes. So here we are, 1932, Hoover being assailed properly as an interventionist big government president by Democrats who promise a 25% reduction in spending. Roosevelt wins, and almost from day one does the opposite of everything that he promised. He doubled spending in his first term. He raised tax rates dramatically. If you wonder why did the Depression linger for so many years, in spite of his bag of tricks, well, one reason is taxes were going up. At one point, Roosevelt will propose a 99.5% top income tax rate on incomes over $100,000. Congress balked at that, wouldn't give it to him. So guess what he did? By executive order, and probably in part because of spite, he comes back and issues an order to tax all incomes at 100%, incomes over $25,000. Can you imagine that? If you make $25,000 and now you make one more dollar, he wants every cent of that. Congress intervened and prevented that from happening. But this is the climate that Roosevelt gives us in the 1930s. Massive government intervention and ever higher taxes that only produced a kind of regime uncertainty, as historian Robert Higgs points out, and kept the economy from recovering. But he did so much more to make him, I think, the principal bad guy of the Great Depression. And I quickly will cite a few more things and then give you time for questions. When he takes office in March of 33, he introduces the New Deal, which is the name given to his package of legislative initiatives, and with big majorities in Congress, he gets everything. He even, within a month of taking office, issued an order that gave Americans less than 1 month, the bulk of April, to turn in their private monetary gold holdings under penalty of $10,000 in fines or 10 years in prison if by May 1st you didn't turn in your, he didn't go after the gold in your teeth, but he wanted all coins, you had to turn them in by the 1st of May. I know some historians say, well, that was because there was a run on the banks. But do you know who started the run on the banks? It was Franklin Roosevelt. Within days of taking office in March, he orders banks in America to stop gold payments. At the same time, he says, oh, don't worry, the gold standard is sound. I'm just telling the banks they're not allowed to pay you the gold that they've promised you, even though he admitted that there was plenty of it. Well, at that point, people said, oh my gosh, this guy's coming after our gold. We better stash it away, buy more if we can, or do anything, show up at the banks if they'll give us anything for our paper dollars. He forced a lack of confidence in the banks by ordering them not to pay gold, and then turned around a couple of weeks later and said, oh, now we have a gold crisis, so I'm going to have to take it. And you were the criminal, by the way. Because it was the American people, he said, who are hoarding gold. And that's why the government has to take it. What do you think the government did with it once it took it? It hoarded it. I mean, think of it. He didn't take all that gold and distribute it to everybody. It went to Fort Knox. So he did what he accused Americans of causing the crisis over. But the worst of the New Deal, very quickly, is a couple pieces of legislation passed in the spring of 33. The National Industrial Recovery Act is one of them. The theory in Washington at the time was that there's too much competition in the economy. Prices are plummeting, and of course they were. The Fed was contracting the money supply. Smoot-Hawley had wiped out foreign markets for farmers. And they thought, well, we got to get prices up. And so they thought, well, let's have industry-wide codes and price controls to fix prices and have penalties if people undercut prevailing prices. It was a famous case of a man named Jack Magid, who was prosecuted under the NIRA. He was a tailor in New Jersey, and he was prosecuted for pressing a suit of clothes for the price of 35 cents instead of the mandated government price of 40 cents. Now think of that. You're lucky if you got a suit of clothes in 1933 and you take it in to Jack and, hey, can you press my clothes for me? And he says, yeah, the government says I have to charge you 40, but I'll charge you 35 cents. You wouldn't think of him as a criminal, would you? But they went after him for that because they thought, well, we can't let prices go down. But if you think that's something, even worse was the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Politicians are fond of giving some of the most destructive legislation these high-sounding names. Agriculture certainly needed adjustment. Thousands of farmers had walked off their farms in bankruptcy. Rural banks, because of that, had failed by the thousands. Agriculture needed adjustment. What did this act do? It levied a new tax on agriculture, processing in particular, just what a depressed industry needed, a new tax, and used the revenue to supervise the destruction of perfectly good fields of corn, wheat, oats, other grains, and the destruction of perfectly healthy cattle, sheep, and pigs. Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace, in one order, demanded the killing of 6 million baby pigs under the AAA. What was the thinking here? Well, they thought, well, if we need to get prices up, we have to get supply down. So let's destroy a whole lot of supply, and that'll make the prices go up. And then the farmers will get more. Of course, they have less to sell now. But somehow that'll spread prosperity into ever-widening circles. That was the thinking. Isn't that ridiculous? I'll never forget Hans Senholz in econ class one time telling this story. And a Brazilian student said to him in a Q&A at the end of the period, he said, "Our country does that with coffee. We pick a state and burn the state. And we don't pick the same state every year, so the same one doesn't get burnt every year, but we burn the coffee crop or a portion of it for the same reason you did." And I'll never forget Dr. Senholz's reply. He said, "Well, if burning a state makes you wealthy, why don't you set fire to the whole country?" This is lunacy as federal policy. The economy finally showed some signs of recovery briefly in '36 when the Supreme Court in the prior year threw out the worst of FDR. They declared both the NIRA and the AAA unconstitutional. And freed of the worst of FDR, the economy began to recover. Unemployment fell into the mid-teens. But then in 1937, Roosevelt achieved a first, a depression within a depression. We saw the swiftest collapse in American economic history in 1937. The stock market collapsed, unemployment soared above 20% again. What happened? Well, several things. One was, believe it or not, this sounds political, but it had economic impact, the Supreme Court packing scheme. Roosevelt won re-election in '36, and he was so mad at the Supreme Court because they've been throwing out his crazy stuff, and so he can't have them impeached. The justices just called the shots as they saw them. So he comes out with a scheme to allow the president to appoint one new justice for every sitting justice who reaches the age of 70 and doesn't retire. Now, we know, looking back on it, and what happened in subsequent years, that within the next 5 years, he could have picked 5 more Supreme Court justices. That was his way of packing it. But it was the first big battle that he lost. Even his own party turned against him, and it died in the Senate. Another problem that explains the '37 collapse was Roosevelt's undistributed profits tax. You know, when a company makes a profit, it can distribute some to its shareholders, or it can retain those earnings. It becomes then usually a very important typical source of capital for growth. But Roosevelt, under the influence of the Keynesians at the time, thought, no, we got to get these companies, get them to spend that and give that money out so it gets out into the economy. As if we don't do something, they're going to just put it in their mattress. So he proposes an undistributed or retained earnings tax, undistributed profits tax of 80%. Well, Congress doesn't give him one that high. It gives him one of 35%, and they realized how harmful that was and did away with it a couple of years later. But if you're a business person and you're trying to decide, should I invest, should I expand my plant, or should I go someplace else or just buy treasury bonds, in this kind of a climate, how can you expect people to invest? But the worst factor that explains the '37 collapse was the Wagner Act, the so-called labor's Magna Carta that gave enormous new powers to labor unions. The number of man-hours lost to strikes with these new powers doubled from 14 million man-hours in '37 to about 30 million man-hours the following year. Organized labor went on a rampage. This was the time of the sit-down strikes in Detroit, and the cost of business soared at a time when profits were hard to come by to begin with. So the economy will limp along in depression. Some say, well, wasn't it the war that finally ended it? And as I suggested earlier, I don't think it was the war that ended it. It may have looked in some ways as though it wasn't as bad. Unemployment wasn't as high. Standards of living, if anything, stagnated or fell in the '40s. We had rationing and you couldn't get simple things. We didn't see real recovery until after the war for 2 big reasons. One will shake the faith of any Keynesian economist who's here, and that is we had the biggest reduction in government spending in American history after World War II, mostly through demobilization. And you know how Keynesians like to say, well, if the government doesn't spend, it'll hurt the economy. We have to spend to stimulate. We had the biggest reduction ever, and we had an economy that took off. Another reason was that Harry Truman wasn't the radical New Dealer that Roosevelt was, and he reluctantly signed into law a Republican measure to reduce corporate income tax rates from a high of 90% down to 35% overnight. And would that make a difference to you? If you were a business person, one day the government's going to take 90% if you take a risk, and next day they'll only take 35%. That's a very powerful incentivizer. So anyway, I have gone a little too long. I just wanted you to know that there were good guys and bad guys in that era. Andrew Mellon, Calvin Coolidge are among the best. And Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt are on the other side of the ledger. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
So we're going to take some questions. Is this working? We're going to take some questions. Is it? Okay.
If anyone has to go, we'll understand, will not be offended, because I know it's 1 o'clock.
So if one of the things I love about this subject is looking around the room at the faces of people when you give the FDR income tax percentages, and I talk on this a lot too, and it never ceases to just blow people's minds. And so if you could reiterate, and I wrote down, I was going to ask you about the gold too, the confiscating of gold. It actually took people's gold, right? But of course, they gave you a price you couldn't refuse, right? You were compensated for it. But just to reiterate, in case, because I know a lot of people probably thought, he didn't really say 99.5% income tax rate on incomes over $100,000. And even Congress wouldn't let him do it, right? And 100% tax rate on incomes over $25,000, right? I mean, that's right. That's right.
The reason Congress balked at the 99.5 is that there were congressmen from states that had their own state income taxes, and in the congressional record, you see them saying, you know, my state imposes a 3% tax. If he takes 99.5, how are we going to get our 3?
So questions?
I got one real quick. When Mellon Hoover around 1930. Was there a split between them, and why do you think Hoover lost?
Yeah, good question. Was there a split between Hoover and Mellon? Mellon was never fond of Hoover. I think his view of Hoover probably was closer to Coolidge's. And Coolidge once said, that man gave me a lot of advice over the years, all of it bad. And there was reportedly a story where Hoover and Mellon were at some convention, and Hoover was at rock bottom in popularity, and apparently he asked Mellon after his speech if he had a nickel because he wanted to call a friend, and Mellon gave him a dime and said, here, call them both. But Coolidge, of course, did not like the hikes in tax rates. He opposed that. Congress increasingly has Democratic activists in it who target Mellon for his tax cuts, and they're raising a fuss. So Hoover thought, I just got to get him out of Washington. So he made him ambassador to Great Britain.
What do you think was lost?
What's that? Oh, why did Hoover lose? I think the state of the economy. People just thought, you know, we've had 3 of this guy's 4 years have been in depression. And Roosevelt was promised, you know, it wasn't because Americans thought, well, let's have a more socialistic president. You could have voted for, what was it, Norman Thomas was on the ballot, a socialist candidate in 1932. But if you believed in free markets and you thought big government was the problem in the Depression, you would have voted for Roosevelt, because he was promising smaller government. That's what the American people voted for, but they kind of got taken in by his rhetoric and didn't, and historians ever since, the bulk of them, I think, kind of cover up the harm that his policies did.
I had a question. Just, I appreciate the history, and I love to, you know, it's very interesting, and it makes me wonder if at the time I would have turned over my gold, or if I would have said, you know, I'm not, like, I wonder how many people just said, I'm not doing that. And then it would have been okay years later, you bring it back out. And now we're hearing about the like the government having a digital currency and asking for our current, like, are we going to have to turn in our money at some point, as though that's a done deal, which I don't think it is, but it is a concern, and I wonder what should our response be to that, or how, I mean, right? Thank you.
Thank you. I think the best estimates, there have been studies trying to figure out how much did the government get when it tried to take all your gold. The best estimates are that it actually got between a quarter and a third of the monetary gold that Americans possessed, which is like saying for every one Americans turned in, they kept 2 or 3. I would guess if for any reason the government tried to do that again today, they'd get far less than that. But of course today, with no formal link between our paper money and gold, there's not the reason for government to take your gold today. They had to do it back then because to honor what was in the law in terms of gold backing of the currency, they wanted to print a lot more. And so in their possession, they thought the gold backing would do that. Today, they could print as much as they want, and that's one of our biggest problems, I think. We're sort of trusting to politicians and the people they appoint that they won't overprint. Given the right circumstances, though, they will print, I can guarantee it.
Like Dr. Jewell, my maternal grandfather he's an interesting guy. He was an Eastern European Catholic working at Edgar Thomson to pay for an engineering degree in tech, and he was poor than me. But he hated Roosevelt, which when I was in high school we fought. I would say, why do you hate Roosevelt? He voted for him once. He ended up having a job with TVA, and then he would never vote for a Democrat for dog catcher. So you're explaining why my grandfather hated him, because he's deceased, so I can't ask him anymore because I'm curious about it. But given today's times, there's a lot of parallels. First of all, most people don't even understand about monetary supply. They don't know what the yuan is. I was talking to a mortgage rep who said, the government doesn't have anything to do with what's happening in our economy. I'm like, so I have a question. How do we get the people to understand? Because I figure most people I speak to don't understand anything. They don't even know the danger of the Chinese yuan. So how do we get that message across? How do we get people to know? I was lucky I took economics at Grove State.
Yeah, same here. First of all, you reminded me of something I heard. Paul, you'll get a kick out of this. I heard this before Reagan, and as fellow fans of Ronald Reagan, we would exempt him from this. But I remember Tom Anderson from Tennessee, a political humorist, describing several presidents in a row, and he said, Franklin Roosevelt proved that a man could be president a lifetime. Harry Truman proved that any man could be president. Dwight Eisenhower proved that we really didn't need one. And every president since has proven that it's dangerous to have one. How do we get people to understand? It comes down to an educational battle. I mean, there's no button to push that will make everybody smarter. You have to look for every opportunity, such as this event today, to tell people a history that they haven't been told. You do that in the classroom, you do it in media, wherever you can. I know sometimes it's frustrating. Is our message getting through? It's not a message that students are hearing at most universities, but I don't know of any other way. Sometimes seeds are being sown, but they don't sprout until conditions are just right. We know that when big changes in the world happen, like the fall of the old Soviet Union and its Eastern European empire, late 80s, early 90s, not many people saw that coming or could have told you what happened in those years. But you look back later and you say, wow, that didn't come out of nowhere. It was percolating beneath the surface. People like Reagan and Thatcher and John Paul II at leadership levels were doing things that helped to make it happen. And by the millions, people living under communism were increasingly taking bold stances and undermining the system from within, such as in Poland in particular. And so you never know. You plant the seeds as best you can, as many of them as you can, everywhere you can, and then the right constellation of personalities, ideas, events might come together at some point, and bingo, we've set the table. That's what we can hope for anyway, so that's what animates me. Just educate as much as you can.
That's such a perfect way to end it, but let's take one more question because I think
Thank you. I was just wondering, since you are an expert and have studied this obviously more extensively than all of us, what would you primarily attribute the motivations of presidents like FDR and that sort of policy? Would you forgive it as simply ignorance and a poor understanding of basic economics, or do you think of it more as politically ideological, as in having more of an inclination towards the Marxist ideologies that you mentioned in the beginning, or even something more personally beneficial like rent-seeking for any sort of government cronies and almost fundraising their salaries for the federal government?
Great question. And I've pondered this myself many times. You know, when you look at people like Franklin Roosevelt, Joe Biden, what motivates them? When it comes to Roosevelt, I know there's a temptation to say, well, he must have been a dyed-in-the-wool ideological left-winger. He really wasn't. I mean, he had kind of leftist leanings, but it's more accurate to say that in economics, he was a dummy. And don't take my word for it. James Warburg was his financial advisor when he was governor of New York and then into the first term as president. And he wrote a book called Hell Bent for Election. And in that book, and it came out in 1935, I think, Warburg explains what he found as he got to know Franklin Roosevelt. He said, I couldn't get to first base in terms of explaining simple economics to him. He had no idea. And even Morgenthau, his Treasury Secretary, later in his diaries talks about how he couldn't believe how Roosevelt would determine the price of gold over eggs and breakfast in bed, and just by things like, oh, well, let's see, 5 is the 5th day of the week, 7 days a week, 5 times 7, 30, let's make it $35. I mean, you know, he was not an economic whiz, and so that made him prone to opportunism. He was very much a political animal, and you combine a political animal with opportunism and a lack of economic knowledge, and very short-term thinking, you get disaster, and that's what we got in him. He was not the ideologue that even Joe Biden is, but not very bright on economics. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
If I may add to that on Margot's question, and Larry will agree with this, and yet FDR had some really hard left ideologues all around him, and the most literally communist penetrated agency for the government was AAA, and it was Whittaker Chambers wrote about that, and Alger Hiss knew about it. The Ware Cell was the group within AAA, and Henry Wallace was the agricultural secretary. So that statistic on killing 6 million baby pigs. I mean, that's how those people thought, right? So in that sense, it was ideological. And yet, too, historians, every presidential survey done of every academic, FDR is always the third most popular, ranked the third best president of all time. Always, always, always. You could bet whatever gold you have left, right? It's going to be either Lincoln or Washington, first or second. They flip. And FDR is always number 3. Always number 3. And if I may add one plug here for Ronald Reagan, who's lucky if he gets in the top 10, but that top rate of 94% under FDR, so JFK eventually brought it down to 70, and then Reagan brought it down to 28. And Reagan, there were 16 tax brackets, and Reagan consolidated them into 2, 28% and 15%, and the 28% has been going up ever since. Right, including George H.W. Bush. Read my lips, no new taxes. He increased it. And then Clinton increased it. And I think Trump brought it down maybe about 35%, something like that. But it's been a battle forever to get that back down. Anyway, thank you very much. That was great. So thanks, everyone, for coming. We'll get this posted online. Bert Folsom, Robert, we should get Bert's presentation posted as well. He spoke at Grove City College about a year or two on FDR and this a similar topic. And we'll see you at the next talk, which is in what? Do we have those at the table? I think those are listed at the table, maybe. I should have checked this out first. No? September, correct? September 19th. Okay, who is it? Reagan versus Kennedy. All right, no, that's it. Gene Copelson, who's a really interesting guy who's coming in from California. He's an expert on the relationship between Reagan, Robert F. Kennedy, and also Dwight Eisenhower. And Reagan and RFK had this amazing debate about a year before RFK was tragically assassinated. 35 years ago, like today, I think, right? I mean, yeah, more than that. Yeah. 68. Yeah, 68. Thank you. It'd be the 55th anniversary, right? He was shot June 5th, 1968. I think he died that night, and completely changed the whole presidential race. And now here we have RFK Jr. running for president. And by the way, imagine if he ends up running third party. If that could cut into Biden's vote total, how that would completely throw the 2024 race into total chaos. I mean, you could, Donald Trump's never gotten more than 46%, but if you had a third-party candidate in it, he could win with 43, like Bill Clinton did in 1992, like Woodrow Wilson did. Oh, well, I'll stop there. I could go on and on with this stuff. Larry Reed will be around. His book is here if you want to get a copy, and grab a copy of The American Spectator on your way out. Thanks a lot.